Welcome, brothers and sisters from Westside and others that may be joining us in our study of Genesis, chapters 12 through 50. We covered chapters 28 and 29 as part one of our lesson 6 this week. And so today we're going to finish up with Genesis chapters 30 and 31, a lot of material in both of those sections. So a couple of things, intro. Somebody had written me an email about what did the abbreviation, the letter A-N-E, capitals, A-N-E, and that's just a simple way of, in the scholarly writings, you'll see it in commentaries sometimes, and it just means the ancient Near East. So the Near East being where Palestine and of course today would be Iraq and Saudi Arabia and Syria and all of that that's in that region that we call the Fertile Crescent that we've been referencing. So that's what ANE stands for. The other thing was, and I'll try to do a map now where you can hear my voice. So I hope this works out. But anyway, again, we've looked at this map before. The Fertile Crescent is that lighter pink area that is shaped like a crescent moon. And right at the top there, you see Mesopotamia. And then Haran is where we see Jacob going to. So that's about a 500-mile journey up from Palestine, in the part of Palestine where he is. And then just so that you can see where Jacob had been, Beersheba, the Negev is that southern area, and so it means the south. Beersheba, where Abraham and Isaac had dwelt. And so this is a map of Israel and Judah, the kingdoms later, much later in time, but it has our cities on it. Beersheba all the way up to Bethel. Remember Bethel that he named the house of God. And so that's where he began his journey. So I wanted to at least show you that on a map so that you would know where we were and what we were talking about in referencing last week. All right, so we ended last week's, or rather, the first part of this week's lesson with the four sons that are rapidly in succession born by Leah. Leah, of course, had been badly mistreated by her father. And of course, Jacob is deceived. And then he, of course, at the end of her week, he marries Rachel and agrees to work for Laban another 7 years. And so Rachel finds herself not being able to bear children. How many times have we encountered that with Sarah, with Rebecca, with Rachel, the matriarchs of the children of Israel, and yet their seeming inability to bear children? Now, Leah, of course, is the exception of that. She will bear 6 sons finally to Jacob, 4 of them in our story so far. And so this first part of chapter 30 is this ongoing turmoil between Leah and Rachel and how Joseph's sons come to pass. So Rachel can't bear children. She has an angry exchange with her husband, Jacob. And out of that, then she decides to give her servant Bilhah. Again, we've seen that. Remember, again, in the law codes they lived under at the time, it was not very, very common that if a woman couldn't give her husband a son, that she would give her handmaid as a secondary wife, a concubine, to Jacob. Later in the story today, Jacob will call Leah and Rachel into the field. He doesn't call Bilhah and Zilpah because, again, they are not considered the primary wives. And in the story that we're reading, when the handmaid become pregnant and give 2 sons, each of them do, Bilhah 2 sons, Zilpah 2 sons. It's not Bilhah that names the sons, it's not Zilpah, but their mistress, the one that they were under. And so Leah and Rachel named the sons that are born to those handmaidens. So Rachel gives Bilhah to Jacob and says to him, "Go into her that she may give birth on my behalf." Verse 3, the English Standard says, literally, the Hebrew says, "upon my knees." So to be euphemism for obviously in the very birth process to be there when that baby is born and therefore claim that baby as her own. The first son is named Dan. Dan means to judge. Remember, I said to you that El is the name for God, El. So, like Daniel, I referenced last time, Daniel means God is my judge. Here, she just uses the short form that God has judged. And that's what she says: God has judged me and heard my voice. So it seems to be the rivalry between her and Leah, that Leah has given Jacob 4 sons at this point. And it says at verse 1 that Rachel envied her sister. So it seems to be that that is the driving force. Of course, the great reproach she'll mention finally when she has her own son, Joseph, that her reproach has been taken away. So it was looked down very disfavorably in this time if you could not give your husband a son to be heir. So the second son is born quickly through Bilhah. His name is Naphtali. We usually say Naphtali, however you want to pronounce it. It means wrestling. So again, just that ongoing rivalry between her and Leah. Rachel doesn't even acknowledge God here, just acknowledges her rivalry with her sister. So Zilpah, or rather Leah, sees that she has stopped bearing for a time, sees that Rachel had given Bilhah, so she gives Zilpah, her handmaid, to Jacob, and in succession, 2 more sons are born. So Leah, obviously, just like any human can, we saw her more spiritual side of her and how she was naming her sons, but she gives way into this rivalry also, and so 2 boys are born to that handmaid, but are of course claimed by Leah. The first son is named Gad, which simply means good fortune, or a troop has come, an army has come. Later, when Jacob blesses Gad in chapter 49 and verse 19, at the close of his life, it'll be more the idea of the troop. The idea there, he'll use the word raid and raider in reference to Gad. But again, no reference to God. The second son, Asher, women will call her happy or fortunate, again, because she has been able to add 2 more sons. So the rivalry between these sisters. Can you imagine what the home life was like between Jacob and between Leah and between Rachel, and then of course how it must have spread into the family at large. Then we are told at verses 14 through 21 that Leah begins to have children again, and this time she adds 2 sons, the final of the sons that she will add that we know about that are recorded in Scripture. If any were born and died, we're not told that, but Leah has a son named Issachar that means reward or wages, and there it says at verse 17, and God listened to Leah. So we know that Leah is praying and that she's asking. Again, this more spiritual side of her comes out in the story. In the sixth son is born Zebulun, which means honor, and she acknowledges God, longs for Jacob's love. But once again, we see that rivalry between her and her sister. And then it says that she bore a daughter, Dinah, and Dinah will play a role in a whole chapter of Genesis that we'll come to when they come back to the land of Canaan. All right, then a very interesting expression at verse 22. It says, then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. So obviously Rachel is praying, but that interesting phrase that we have not commented on before, I don't think. One of them came in the material before what we're covering, 12 through 50. But when God remembers someone, it's real interesting in the Old Testament. It'll say God remembered someone or a nation of people, and then he takes action. And that action is to deliver, to redeem from some kind of a terrible crisis. For instance, God remembered Noah and those that were in the ark, it says in Genesis 8 and verse 1, and because of that, he made a wind to pass over the oceans of water, and the water subsided. And again, God delivered them out of the ark. Then it says of Abraham that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the overthrow. So again, the remembering of someone, the acknowledging of their importance to God and to the fact that he takes awareness. And I don't think of remembrance in the sense of God forgot and then all of a sudden, oh, he wakes up and, remembers them like humans can do. But it has the idea of remembering, putting together the story that has been being laid out, and that God is doing something, always verbs of action, and particularly the idea of redeeming, of delivering the person that's in a great crisis. In Exodus, you'll come to it a couple of times about the nation of Israel, Exodus 2:24, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they heard the groanings of Israel. And so he commences the deliverance that we call the redemption of Israel through Moses. And in chapter 6 and verse 5, that's mentioned again. In the story of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 19, it says, God remembered Hannah, and Elkanah, her husband, knew Hannah, and she bore a son who she named Samuel. So very, very interesting word, a concept we don't normally use in our time, but is often used in the book of Genesis, Exodus, and beyond. God remembered Rachel, listened to her, and she brought forth a son. And she said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph. That means, may he add another son. So again, it just seems like the rivalry. She can't be satisfied with one son. May there be more sons than this. My reproach, yes, has been taken away by Joseph, but may there be more sons because of this constant rivalry with her sister Leah. All right, so then we come to verse 25, and this chapter deals with both the family life of Jacob and now the prosperity of Jacob. As soon as Rachel had born Joseph a son, now that's important in this time frame, because remember that he served 7 years for each daughter. So the first 7 years went by very quickly because of his love for Rachel, and then he's deceived. Leah's given under the cover of darkness, and then he performs her week, a honeymoon, we would say, and then Laban gives him Rachel for another 7 years. So we know that Rachel goes for 13 years not being able to bear a son, and then obviously she gets pregnant 9 years, and in that we learn this time period by knowing that about the 7 years, because the text says at verse 25, as soon as Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go to my own home country. So the 9 months of his birth, so we're saying 13, that the 14th year came, and Joseph says to Laban, let me go back. And we know that connection back to chapter 29, verse 27 and 30 about that second 7 years. And so Jacob has never lost sight of where he wants to go back to. He remembers Bethel. God will even, we see in the story today, reference himself to Jacob when he comes to Jacob as the God of Bethel. And so that vow that Jacob made to him there, the promises that God made, all of that's built of it. The God of Abraham and Isaac is the God of Jacob too. And Jacob is coming to grow. He's going to really grow in chapter 32. As we will see in that great story, much like what happened to Abraham in Genesis 22. So the covenant promises are acknowledged in this story, because when he says to Laban, let me have my wives and my children that might go, that's all he has. Laban has given him virtually nothing but his pay, his wages to be able to live, and he has a family. But Laban says to him, if I have found favor in your sight, verse 27, I have learned by divination that the Lord, he uses the covenant name, has blessed me because of you. So there are that blessing that God said, I will bless him that blesses you, I will curse him that curses you, has now lopped over, obviously, and extended to what's happened to Laban. And Laban doesn't want to lose that. I think he realizes he was poor before he came. Jacob's going to acknowledge that. Jacob says to him, you yourself know how I served you, how your livestock have fared with me, for you had little before I came, and it has increased abundantly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I turn. But now he says, how shall I provide for my own household? I mean, Laban is cunning. He's not treated Jacob like you would treat a son-in-law. Let him build up his fortune and his wealth. But it's only Laban thinking about his sons, as we will find out, and not about his daughters at all. And so the covenant promises are talked about here. Laban, to go back to that verse about, he says, I've learned by divination, he uses Yahweh's name, but see, there is that mixture of he's an idolater, and so Yahweh is just another God among the gods. But obviously this God, Yahweh, is answering and blessing is the way Laban would see it. So Jacob proposes that obviously to take the inferior animals. He says, then let my wages be, I will remove today the spotted, the speckled, every black lamb. They shall be my wages. And boy, Laban doesn't even wait a minute. He says, good, great. We'll let that be. So apparently those colors were not looked on as being the best. And Laban then, he goes through the flock and he separates all of that. And then he puts those colored animals, the speckled, the spotted, the black lambs, in the control of his sons. He's going to know who's controlling Jacob's, because Jacob, remember, has been blessing Laban. It's all been Laban's before. So he puts the rest of the flock, which is Laban's flock, under Jacob's control. And Jacob says, if anything's found from one side to the other, you'd know that it's been stolen. And Laban makes certain of it. He puts 3 days journey. You can imagine how far you might could drive a flock in 3 days. So he puts maybe 30 miles between the flocks. And that way there's no chance that anything bad can go. But again, as Jacob has acknowledged, God has blessed your flock because of me. I want us to understand, I believe Jacob knows that God will continue to bless him as he had promised. And so Jacob takes, we read that story about the fresh sticks of poplar and almond and peeled them, and he put them in the troughs before the sheep as they bred and the goats as they bred. And we don't need to see in that some kind of superstition. It was probably just the accepted understanding at the time when they did know about genetics. They did know how all of this worked. But God is going, of course, override that. Jacob does what he knows was common probably to be done in that day. But as a result of it, as you read down in the chapter, and even that he dealt with the feebler and the stronger as he bred animals out, which of course is something that happens today too when people are in animal husbandry, to breed the stronger ones and the more good looking ones, the ones that yield the kind of meat cuts that people want in our day and age. Those kinds of things are bred out of animals and into animals, as we'd say. And the same thing happens here. And thus the man increased, it says of Jacob, and thus the man increased greatly and had large flocks, female servants, male servants, and camels and donkeys. And so God blesses Jacob greatly, and now this is part of his wages. So we begin chapter 31, and this will be, of course, as Jacob will flee back to Canaan. So let's begin verses 1 through 3. Now Jacob heard that the sons of Laban were saying, Jacob has taken all that was our father's, and from what our father has, he has gained all this wealth. And Jacob saw that Laban did not regard him with favor as before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you. So Laban's sons were angry at Jacob acquiring their father's wealth. Now all that Laban had plotted has been turned upside down on its head, and it's Jacob that has come out on the better end. And the sons are seeing that all of the flocks have gone to Jacob. Laban no longer favors him. We're going to find out in the story, chapter 31, that Laban changes the wages. He would say sometimes, no, you're now it's speckled. You get speckled ones. And if he said that, the sheep and the goats bore speckled. Well, it'd be spotted this time. And it didn't matter what he said. God blessed him. And so they do not look, the family Laban, the sons, do not look at favor upon Jacob. And at that point, Yahweh directs Jacob to return to Canaan. And so in verse 4, he calls Rachel and Leah into a field, obviously to visit where no one else can overhear them. And he proposes that to tell them, you know how Laban has treated me, how he had changed my wages, and yet thus God has taken away the livestock of your father and given it to me. He would have left me nothing, Jacob will say on more than one occasion. But here we are introduced to a dream that God gave him. And he said, in the breeding season of the flock, verse 10, I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream that the goats that mated with the flock were striped, spotted, and mottled. And the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I said, here I am. He said, lift up your eyes and see all the goats that mate with the flock are striped, spotted, and mottled. For I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, the house of God, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now arise, go out from this land and return to the land of your kindred. So God is watching. Boy, what a powerful thing. Statements that just come out in his book that God sees what we are doing. He knows what we are doing. He hears what we are doing. A God that can know every last one of us. I mean, we just are dealing with a small congregations. We talk about the 130 or so people here. Think about that. He knows everyone's thoughts. He knows what we're doing. He knows what we're thinking. And then all of the world of billions of people is a powerful God, the God Almighty that we cannot even begin to comprehend. But to understand and to believe in and to trust that he cares for us uh, through Jesus Christ. As he said, cast all our burden upon him, for he cares for us in 1 Peter 5 and verse 7. And so here, obviously, because Jacob is so central to the plan of God, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he is blessing Jacob at every turn. And no matter what Laban did, he could not overcome it, could not overcome Jacob being blessed. And so Rachel and Leah respond to him and say, is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us. Remember how we talked about them, their names being cow and you, and now they acknowledge we've been treated like livestock, and has indeed devoured our money. All of the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now, then, whatever God has said to you, do. Because they recognize then that Laban has mistreated them. Again, their faith may not be what it should be either at this point, as we'll see in the story, particularly about Rachel. But nonetheless, they recognize the truth of what Jacob is saying. And so Jacob arose and set his sons and wives on camel, drove away the livestock, and takes off while Laban is shearing sheep far away. And it's not until the third day after Jacob has fled that Laban hears of what has happened. And so Laban, gets up in hot pursuit. We know that he comes back to wherever the home is because he's going to discover a theft that has taken place. And it's a very important part of the story. In verse 19, Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole her father's household gods. And Jacob tricked Laban the Aramean by not telling him that he intended to flee. This is not a smart thing that Jacob does. Did he think that Laban, after the way he has behaved and acted, and that now that they're negative feelings, and somehow Jacob can just get away and they're not going to do anything about it? I suppose Jacob was hoping after he's put 3 days distance between him, they're not going to pursue. But that was misunderstanding the man that he was dealing with. And though a man of faith, as all men of faith are, he does something that is not wise, doesn't always act in faith. He acted in fear, as he says in verse 31, even though God has said, I will be with you, and the vow that you made to me, that I will protect you. And so Laban is against Jacob, and God is with Jacob, as verse 5 we've already read. At verse 6 and 7, Laban cheats Jacob, all those different 10 times changing, yet God did not let Jacob be harmed. And Laban changed Jacob's wages, verse 8 and 9, and yet God changed Laban and Jacob's flocks so that it's Jacob that ends up having the most. And so Rachel steals her father's household gods. The household gods, again, shows the idolatry of Laban, this mixture of being able to use Yahweh's name, but not truly following Yahweh, making him the one and only God. We're going to see how Jacob does that when he enters the land of Canaan. Three different commentators, I'll just read their short reference to it. Kyle says the possessor of the household gods had claim under the laws of that time and under the laws that were in that region, Code of Hammurabi, the Code of Nuzi, codes of Mari that have been dug up and found in those clay tablets, have given us much insight into the time period of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So if you had the household gods, you had claim to the inheritance of that house. Morrison says it held the paternal authority of the head of the house. And Harrison said Nuzi law recognized as the leader of the family the one who had possession of the household idol. So a number of different commentators are going to say the same thing to us, and that is that's the reason Rachel stole the household gods. The possession of them meant that her husband is to be the rightful, and therefore her. Remember that she and Leah says, all that you have belongs to us and to our children. So Laban takes his kinsman at verse 23 in hot pursuit, the same word that's used, by the way, in chapter 14 about that hostile pursuit of the army that had taken Lot. Laban boasts that it was in his power to harm Jacob, and I believe he well intended to harm him. Jacob believed that Laban would have taken all of Jacob's flocks in verse 42 and also at verse 31. So one can only imagine the havoc that Laban would have committed against him. And yet, the night before he will finally catch up with Jacob, but God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream by night and said to him, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." So it's a stern warning. I mean, he doesn't even say, here's what's going to happen to you if you don't do what I say, like we've seen in times past with Abimelech. If he didn't restore Abraham, what would happen to him? He and all that he had would die. But Laban understands the seriousness of it. In fact, will be moved, I think, is why Jacob will call a particular name of God that's very interesting to us. So when he does catch up with him, Laban overtakes him, and Jacob had pitched his tent. Laban said, "What have you done?" Verse 26, "And why have you tricked me and driven my daughters away like captives of the sword? And why did you flee secretly and not even let me send you away with a feast and the tambourine and lyre? And why did you not permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters farewell? You've done foolishly. It's in my power to do you harm. But the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, Be careful," and repeats that, not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. "And now you've gone away because you long greatly for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods?" In other words, Laban's saying, okay, so I can't do anything, I'm having to show respect to your God because he came to me in a dream, but why did you steal my gods? And so when Jacob responds to him in anger, he says to him basically, first of all, because I was afraid, and there's that fear factor that we said, for I thought that you would take your daughters away from me by force. I mean, he had been reading Laban correctly in the way that Laban's sons, and you imagine they're all there staring at him, and what they wanted to do to him, Laban was not permitting. "Anyone with whom you find your God shall not live in the presence of our kinsmen," pointed out, because I've not taken them. But it says Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. And the code of Hammurabi that is in the Mesopotamian area would date back more to the time of Abraham, but would suppose the same thing would be understood in this time, not that much later. Someone stealing the property of a god or a temple was to be put to death. So again, the idea of blasphemy against the god. So anyone that you find those gods with, they should die. And he has unwittingly condemned Rachel to death, did not know and could not know that Rachel's going to die prematurely at the death of her second son. And so Laban goes and searches and comes in the tent and says, verse 33, 35, that Rachel pretends to be as in the way of women, as it is said. And Laban was feeling all about the tent, but she was sitting on a saddle of a camel and had hidden the idols underneath that. Careful search on them, because these idols, by the way, were like terracotta. They're found all over in so many digs. In fact, some of the places you can buy them from in New York City that deal in antiquities, I mean, they're not very expensive. I mean, they're only a few $100s at times because there's so many of them. But anyway, they would be very short, 6, 7, 8, maybe a foot tall at the most at times. And they would be in kind of a grotto, something cut out in the wall. There'd be a place where they would be displayed and of course prayed to and that type of thing. So that's why he's down feeling from it. These not huge things that he's looking for. And interesting, the same verb that Isaac felt Jacob is used here, that kind of careful, meticulous thing. And so he can't find him. And so then Jacob has his say. And so these 20 years, verse 3, so now we know 7 years serving each daughter, so 14. So he served 6 more years, those wages. So now a total of 20 years. Now the last 6 have been for the flock. Your ewes and your female goats did not miscarry. I've not eaten your rams. What was torn by wild beasts I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it myself. From my hand you required it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. One day I was reading that, not for this study, but it occurred to me that even though God was blessing Jacob, he didn't protect Jacob's flocks from predators. He still lost to animals that preyed on his flock. He still lost to people that stole them. But overall, it was blessing that God was always outdoing the things that he lost. And I think the thing we need to learn out of that, folks, is that our lives are not always going to go smoothly, and we're going to lose. We're going to have those that steal, those that mistreat us, those that do wrong by us. But yet, God is always there to bless us. And if we look over the tenor of our lives and think back over it, so often that's what we see. We understand the good things that have outweighed the bad things. But God doesn't protect us as he didn't protect Jacob from all the bad things that could happen. I was there, the heat consumed me by day, the cold by night, the sleep fled from my eyes. I mean, Jacob had to, God's not just blessing him with Jacob just sitting back in a, as we could say, a beanbag chair back in the tent and just letting God do it all. You and I have to work, and God has always meant us to work. And yet, he's in the story then saying, I did all for you, and God blessed it. And these 20 years I've been in your house, and he says, I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flock, and you changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and now here comes a unique name, and the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty handed. But God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night. So a unique reference to God in Scripture. It's going to occur again at verse 53. And one of the very few times you ever see that. It is substituting by metonymy, where the effect, fear, is placed for the cause, God. And you think especially about Laban, for instance. So what he is saying basically is, you fear him, and rightly so. The great power is in his hands. If you were to harm me, what would happen to you would be terrifying and terrible. As he said to Abimelech long ago, if you don't return this man's wife to him, you and all you have will die, will surely die. And so the God that brings terror in the heart is the reference that Jacob has. So yes, fear is a right response with God, but it shouldn't be all our response to understanding who God is. But yes, that severity, the goodness, behold the goodness and severity of God, as Paul says in Romans 11 and verse 22, is what we need to understand also. And so it is brought out here. And so the rest of the story is basically Laban making a witness between them. Sometimes I've had people, one time I left a congregation, I thought it was kind of funny. They made a cake for me, and the lady had put on there Mizpah, that pillar that Laban sets up, and it means watch post. May God watch between me and you, this heap be witness between you and me. May God watch between us, is witness between you and me. The Lord watch between you and me when we are out of one another's sight. And I knew they meant that, especially the lady that did it, as a good and kind thing. May God watch between us. But that's not the way it's intended here. It was like, don't you cross over. This is supposed to be the barrier. Don't you come over to me anymore, and I'm not going to come pursue you anymore. Laban knows he can't do anything about it, but he wants to make sure that Jacob doesn't cross back over, and he doesn't want any more to do with him, and sends him off on his way. And so they have a great feast. The God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us. Jacob swore by the fear. There's the second usage, verse 53, of his father Isaac. Jacob offered a sacrifice in the hill country, called his kinsmen to eat bread. They ate bread and spent the night. And the next morning, Laban kisses all of his grandchildren and his daughters, and then departs. And so now we begin really with earnestness the story of Jacob in Canaan. The next concern, of course, Jacob's going to have is Esau. And that sets up chapter 32, which is a very, very fascinating chapter and the growth of Jacob's faith. So thank you for listening.